March 24, 1968, Ben Het Special Forces Camp, where the Laotian, Cambodian, and South Vietnamese borders met in jungle darkness. The North Vietnamese army was about to discover that some assumptions cost lives. Their PT-76 tanks rolled forward through the night, crews confident in their firepower. Soviet doctrine had taught them these amphibious tanks could overwhelm isolated American positions. The math seemed simple: 3 tanks, multiple armored personnel carriers, and the element of surprise against a remote camp. But as their 76mm guns opened fire on the dug-in American positions, something impossible happened. The shells struck and bounced. Again and again. The metallic ping of deflected rounds echoed across the battlefield as NVA tankers realized their worst nightmare. They were facing M48 Pattons, tanks with frontal armor so thick their weapons might as well have been throwing stones. What happened next would terrify every North Vietnamese tank crew for the rest of the war. Subscribe for more untold war stories. The first shell hit at 1800 hours, just as the tropical sun began its descent behind the Annamite Range. Captain William Burke felt the impact through the hull of his M48A3 Patton before he heard it, a dull thud that resonated through 52 tons of American steel. He was buttoned up inside the turret, sweat already soaking through his fatigues in the suffocating heat that turned every tank into a mobile oven. Through his periscope, he watched the jungle tree line 800 meters to the northeast, where muzzle flashes had just revealed what intelligence reports said shouldn't exist this far south: enemy armor. Ben Het Special Forces Camp occupied a strategic nightmare. Perched near the tri-border junction where Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam converged, the outpost sat isolated in a sea of green, connected to civilization by a single dirt road that turned to soup during monsoon season. Company B, 1st Battalion, 69th Armour, had arrived 3 weeks earlier, their M48 Pattons dug into defensive positions around the camp's perimeter. The tanks had seemed like overkill at the time. The North Vietnamese army didn't use armour in the Central Highlands. Everyone knew that. The terrain was too rugged, the logistics too complicated, the roads too primitive for mechanized warfare. Everyone had been wrong. Burke keyed his radio. "All Bravo elements, enemy armour confirmed. PT-76s, count 3, with supporting infantry, range 800 meters and closing." The response crackled back from Sergeant First Class Henry Doyle, commanding the Patton positioned 50 meters to Burke's left. "Confirmed visual. Permission to engage. Hold fire. Let them come." Burke's voice remained steady, though his pulse hammered against his temples. This was the moment doctrine had prepared them for, yet somehow failed to capture. The manuals talked about armor versus armor engagements in abstract terms, penetration values, effective ranges, kill probabilities. They never mentioned the copper taste of adrenaline or the way time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously when 14-ton enemy tanks emerged from jungle shadows with their guns elevated toward your position. Through the commander's cupola, Burke studied the approaching Soviet-designed vehicles. The PT-76 was an amphibious tank built for river crossings and wetland operations. Its silhouette sat low and sleek, turret barely rising above the hull. The North Vietnamese had chosen their equipment well for Vietnam's waterlogged terrain. What they hadn't counted on was meeting American main battle tanks designed for the plains of Central Europe, built to stop Soviet T-54s and IS-3s with armor thick enough to laugh at anything short of a direct hit from a high-velocity gun. The technical disparity was stark. Burke's M48 mounted a 105mm rifled gun capable of firing armor-piercing rounds at velocities that could punch through tank armor at 3,000 meters. Its frontal glacis plate measured 120mm thick, angled at 30 degrees to deflect incoming fire. The PT-76 carried a 76.2mm gun, respectable against light armor and fortifications, nearly useless against a Patton's frontal protection. Its own armor maxed out at 45mm on the turret face, thin enough that Burke's gunner could penetrate it with high-explosive rounds, let alone armor-piercing shot. But the North Vietnamese tank commanders didn't know that yet. The lead PT-76 fired first. Burke saw the muzzle flash, then watched the tracer arc across the darkening sky. The round struck his tank's frontal slope with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil, loud, sharp, but ultimately ineffective. The shell ricocheted upward, tumbling end over end before disappearing into the jungle canopy behind the American lines. Inside the turret, Specialist Richard Johnson had already loaded a round into the breech. "Heat round loaded," he called out, his voice tight with tension. "Identified," Burke's gunner confirmed, his eye pressed to the sight. "Range 700 meters. Fire when ready." The M48 rocked backward as the main gun discharged. The high-explosive anti-tank round crossed the distance in less than 2 seconds, striking the lead PT-76 just below the turret ring. The shaped charge detonated on impact, focusing its energy into a superheated jet of molten metal that burned through the Soviet tank's armor like a cutting torch through aluminum foil. The PT-76 shuddered, then erupted in a fireball as ammunition stores cooked off inside the hull. The second enemy tank fired. This round struck Burke's Patton dead center on the mantlet, where the gun met the turret face. Metal screamed against metal. The shell fragmented on impact, spraying harmless debris across the tank's glacis plate. Burke felt the hit, but knew immediately his tank was undamaged. The M48's armor had held. The shell had simply bounced. To the left, Doyle's Patton opened fire. Another PT-76 staggered as the round penetrated its side armor, transforming the vehicle's interior into a blast furnace. The third enemy tank attempted to reverse, its commander apparently realizing that pressing forward meant certain death. But the PT-76's top speed of 42 kilometers per hour seemed glacial compared to the M48's ability to traverse its turret and acquire targets. Burke's gunner was already tracking the retreating vehicle. Third target, bearing northeast, range 900 meters. Identified. Fire. The round caught the fleeing PT-76 in the engine compartment. The tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from its rear deck. Through his periscope, Burke saw the crew hatches fly open as North Vietnamese tankers bailed out, abandoning their crippled vehicle to sprint for the jungle's protective darkness. Behind the destroyed tanks, BTR-50 armored personnel carriers were disgorging infantry. Tracer fire lit up the perimeter as Special Forces troops and their Montagnard allies opened up with machine guns and mortars. The battle had shifted from armor duel to combined arms chaos in less than 5 minutes. Burke switched to the battalion net. Bravo 6 to all elements. Enemy armor neutralized. Continuing engagement against infantry and APCs. The radio crackled with acknowledgements, but Burke barely heard them. He was focused on the battlefield unfolding before him, watching as the North Vietnamese assault, so carefully planned, so confidently executed, disintegrated against the technological reality of American armor. Somewhere out there in the gathering darkness, enemy tank commanders were experiencing the terror of impotence, firing weapons that couldn't harm their opponents, while facing guns that could kill them at ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. This wasn't the guerrilla war of ambushes and booby traps that defined most of Vietnam. This was industrial warfare, where tons of steel and millimeters of armor determined who lived and who burned. And tonight at Ben Het, the North Vietnamese army had learned a lesson written in flame and shattered metal. Bringing light tanks to fight main battle tanks was suicide with extra steps. The sun finally disappeared below the horizon, and the real darkness began. Midnight came with the sound of engines. Lieutenant Colonel Hoang Minh Tuan listened to the reports filtering through his command post, positioned 3 kilometers from the American perimeter, and felt the first cold threads of doubt weaving through his confidence. 3 PT-76s destroyed in the opening assault. No American armor losses. His radioman's voice carried a tremor that Tuan had never heard before, and the colonel understood why. Tank crews were supposed to fear infantry with anti-tank weapons, not other tanks. But the Americans had turned that assumption inside out. Tuan had built his reputation on aggressive armored tactics, on using speed and surprise to overwhelm defensive positions before the enemy could coordinate a response. The plan for Ben Het had seemed textbook: hit them at dusk when visibility favored the attackers, use the PT-76's superior mobility to close the distance quickly, and rely on massed fire to suppress the defenders while infantry infiltrated the perimeter. The American tanks were supposed to be vulnerable in close quarters, their heavy armor offset by poor maneuverability in restricted terrain. But doctrine written in Hanoi didn't account for what happened when your shells simply bounced off. He ordered the second wave forward anyway. 5 PT-76s this time, supported by 4 BTR-50 personnel carriers loaded with assault troops. The armored vehicles moved through the darkness with their headlights off, navigating by moonlight and the distant glow of fires still burning from the first engagement. Inside each tank, 4-man crews prepared for battle with a growing sense that they were being fed into a meat grinder. Corporal Nguyen Tang Tun sat in the gunner's position of the lead tank, his hands slick with sweat on the controls of the 76mm gun. He was 19 years old and had trained for 8 months on Soviet equipment at a base outside Hanoi. His instructors had taught him to calculate range, adjust for wind and temperature, and identify silhouettes of American vehicles. What they hadn't taught him was what to do when your training proved worthless against an enemy your weapons couldn't hurt. Through his sight, Nguyen watched the American positions materialize out of the darkness. The M48 Pattons sat hull down in prepared fighting positions, only their turrets visible above earthen berms that added another layer of protection to their already formidable armor. The positioning was professional, overlapping fields of fire that left no safe approach angle. Nguyen's tank commander gave the order to fire at 600 meters, and the young corporal squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. The tank rocked from the recoil. Through the sight, Nguyen saw his round strike an M48 squarely on the turret face. For a fraction of a second, he allowed himself to hope. Then he watched the shell ricochet skyward. Deflected by armor, his gun simply couldn't penetrate. The American tank didn't even pause. Its turret traversed with mechanical precision, the long barrel of the 105mm gun sweeping toward Nguyen's position like the finger of death. Inside Burke's Patton, the engagement had become routine. Johnson had established a rhythm with the loading procedure, slamming rounds into the breech with practiced efficiency. The gunner called out targets with the detached professionalism of a man doing a job he'd done 100 times on the practice range. Burke coordinated fire between his tank and Doyle's, ensuring they weren't both engaging the same target while enemy vehicles went unengaged. The second wave died harder than the first. The NVA tankers had learned to jink and weave, trying to present moving targets that were harder to hit. But the M48 stabilization system and optical rangefinders negated much of that advantage. Burke watched through his periscope as Doyle's tank fired, the tracer round arcing across the night to punch through a PT-76's side armor at 800 meters. The enemy tank lurched sideways, its left track blown off by the internal explosion. The crew bailed out immediately, silhouettes sprinting for cover as machine gun fire from the defensive perimeter kicked up dirt around their feet. Another PT-76 attempted a flanking maneuver, trying to get around to the American tank's more vulnerable side armor. Burke rotated his cupola, tracking the movement. Driver, traverse right. Gunner, target bearing 045, range 700 meters. Identified. Fire. The enemy tank exploded before it could bring its gun to bear. The shaped charge had found the ammunition storage, and the PT-76 transformed into a pillar of flame that illuminated the battlefield like a second sun. By its light, Burke could see the remaining NVA armor attempting to withdraw, reversing at their maximum speed of 42 kilometers per hour, while American shells pursued them into the darkness. But withdrawal under fire was nearly impossible. The M48 Pattons could fire up to 10 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, and Burke's crew was approaching that theoretical maximum. Johnson's arms burned from the exertion of loading, the spent shell casings piling up inside the turret, but he kept moving. Another round. Another target. Another flash of impact and explosion. Nguyen Tan Tuan never saw the round that killed him. His tank took a direct hit to the turret from Sergeant Doyle's Patton at 213 meters. The armor-piercing round penetrated cleanly, and the overpressure from the explosion killed the entire crew instantly. The PT-76 rolled to a stop, smoke pouring from every hatch and vision port, adding another burning wreck to the graveyard forming around Ben Het's perimeter. By 0300 hours, the second assault had collapsed completely. Of the 5 PT-76s committed to the attack, 4 were destroyed, and 1 had thrown a track trying to reverse over rough terrain, leaving it immobilized and abandoned by its crew. The BTR-50s had fared no better, their thin armor no match for American machine guns and recoilless rifles. The infantry they'd carried had melted back into the jungle, leaving their dead behind in the wire. Lieutenant Colonel Tuan stood in his command post and acknowledged the reality he'd been avoiding for hours. His tanks couldn't hurt the Americans. Every engagement ended the same way, NVA shells bouncing harmlessly off M48 armor, while American guns tore through Soviet-designed vehicles like they were made of cardboard. The technological gap wasn't just wide, it was absolute. He ordered a general withdrawal. His remaining tanks would retreat to positions north of the camp, beyond the range of American guns, and wait for further instructions from division headquarters. But Tuan knew the truth, even if he couldn't say it aloud. The assault on Ben Het had failed not because of poor tactics or inadequate training, but because his army had brought weapons to a fight that required better weapons. The North Vietnamese could match American infantry. They could outfight them in the jungle, outlast them in the tunnels, and bleed them in 1,000 small engagements across the countryside. But they couldn't fight American tanks with tanks that couldn't penetrate American armor. That lesson had been written in fire tonight, and every surviving NVA tanker would carry it with them for the rest of the war. Some advantages couldn't be overcome with courage or determination or revolutionary fervor. Sometimes, steel was just steel, and thickness mattered more than ideology. Dawn arrived with smoke still rising from the battlefield. Captain Burke stood in his cupola, the cool morning air a relief after 12 hours buttoned up inside the Patton's suffocating interior. His eyes burned from fatigue and cordite fumes. His uniform was soaked through with sweat that had dried and soaked through again multiple times during the night. But he was alive, and his tank was still functional, and those two facts mattered more than comfort. The NVA hadn't given up after the second wave. They'd tried again at 0430, this time without armor. Infantry assault teams had probed the perimeter with satchel charges and rocket-propelled grenades, looking for weak points in the defense. The attack had been desperate and uncoordinated, the kind of assault that happened when commanders ran out of good options and settled for bad ones. Burke's tank had supported the defensive line with high explosive rounds and machine gun fire, but the real work had been done by the Special Forces troops and Montagnard fighters who held the wire against human wave tactics that belonged to another era. Now, as the sun climbed over the mountains and burned away the morning mist, Burke could see the full scope of the night's carnage. 7 PT-76 tanks lay scattered across the approaches to Ben Het, some still smouldering, others cold and silent, like steel tombstones, marking where the NVA's armoured assault had died. 3 BTR-50 personnel carriers had been abandoned intact, their crews having fled when it became clear that advancing meant death. The ground between the tree line and the defensive perimeter was churned mud and shell craters, littered with equipment the NVA had dropped in their retreat. Burke keyed his radio to the battalion. Net. Bravo 6 to Bravo 5. What's your status? Sergeant Doyle's voice came back immediately, tired but steady. Operational. We took 1 hit on the right sponson but no penetration. Armor held. Crews intact. Roger that. Stand by for damage assessment and resupply. Burke dropped back inside the turret and took stock of his own situation. The Patton had been hit 6 times during the engagement. 4 rounds had struck the frontal glasses and bounced clean. 1 had hit the turret mantlet and fragmented without penetrating. The 6th round, fired from close range during the final assault, had struck low on the hull's side armor at an acute angle. That one had penetrated. The damage was serious but not catastrophic. The round had punched through the thinner side armor and detonated inside the sponson, the storage area between the inner and outer hull. Specialist Johnson had been thrown against the turret basket by the blast. He'd survived, but his left arm was broken and his face was peppered with metal fragments. The loader had kept working through the pain for another 40 minutes before Burke ordered him evacuated to the aid station. Private First Class Marcus Webb, killed instantly when shrapnel found him in the driver's compartment, hadn't been as fortunate. Corporal James Mitchell, the gunner, had taken fragments to his leg but refused evacuation until the battle ended. 2 men, 1 dead, 1 wounded. The price for holding the line against an enemy that had thrown everything they had at Ben Het and failed. Burke climbed out of the turret and walked the perimeter of his tank, running his hand along the scarred armor. The impacts from the PT-76's 76mm shells had left deep gouges in the steel, craters where the rounds had struck and deformed before ricocheting away. But they hadn't penetrated. The M48's frontal armor, 120mm of face-hardened steel angled to maximize effective thickness, had done exactly what the engineers at Chrysler's Delaware defense plant had designed it to do. It had kept the crew alive. Sergeant Doyle approached, his tanker's coveralls black with oil and carbon. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but his eyes were alert. "Hell of a night, sir." "That's one way to put it." Burke gestured toward the wrecked PT-76s. "What do you make of it?" Doyle studied the destroyed vehicles for a long moment before answering. They didn't know what they were getting into. Probably thought the PT-76 could go toe-to-toe with our tanks, or at least hurt us enough to make us think twice about standing our ground. They were wrong. "Soviet doctrine," Burke said. "Use speed and numbers to overwhelm defensive positions. Works fine against infantry or light armor. Doesn't work when you run into something that outguns you and can't be hurt by return fire." "Think they'll try again?" No. Burke was certain of that. They'll probe, they'll harass, they might even hit us with artillery or rockets, but they won't send tanks. Not after this. We just destroyed nearly a third of their armored capability in the Central Highlands in one night. That's not a loss they can absorb and keep fighting the same way. A jeep pulled up, carrying Captain Thomas Reynolds from the Special Forces A-team that ran Ben Het. Reynolds dismounted and surveyed the battlefield with the expression of a man who'd seen too much combat to be surprised by anything anymore. "Your tankers saved our asses last night, Bill. Without you, they would have been inside the wire." Burke nodded. "That's what we're here for. What's the butcher's bill on your side?" 3 KIA, 11 wounded. Could have been a lot worse." Reynolds paused, then added, "We found bodies out by that closest PT-76. Tank crew. They bailed out after you hit them, but didn't make it to the tree line. One of them had a journal." "You read it?" "Intel team's looking at it now, but I skimmed it. Kid was 19, trained in the Soviet Union, proud to be serving the revolution." Reynolds shook his head. "Last entry was from yesterday afternoon. He wrote about how confident they were, how the Americans wouldn't expect armor this far north, how they'd punch through and prove that even with all our technology, we couldn't hold the highlands." Burke thought about that. About a 19-year-old corporal who'd believed in his mission and his equipment, who'd climbed into a PT-76 convinced he was part of something historic, only to discover in his final moments that confidence meant nothing when your gun couldn't hurt the enemy, and their gun could vaporize you from ranges where you couldn't effectively shoot back. "He find out different?" "The hard way." Reynolds looked at the destroyed tanks, then back at Burke. "You know what this means, right? They're going to study this. Every tank engagement from here on out, they're going to remember Ben Het. Remember that going head-to-head with American armor is suicide." Burke understood the implication. The North Vietnamese weren't stupid. They learned from their mistakes, adapted their tactics, evolved their strategy. They'd thrown armor at Ben Het, expecting one outcome and gotten another. The lesson wouldn't be lost. Future engagements would look different, ambushes with RPGs and recoilless rifles, attacks on supply columns instead of fortified positions, anything to avoid giving M48 Pattons a clear field of fire and time to work. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, Burke had a damaged tank to repair, a crew to rest, and a perimeter to secure. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last wisps of smoke and revealing the Central Highlands in all their morning clarity. Somewhere out there, Lieutenant Colonel Tuan was reporting to his superiors, explaining how the assault had failed, how American armor had proven invincible against Soviet-designed light tanks. The technological gap between the two sides wasn't going to close. If anything, it would widen as the war continued. The United States would send better tanks, better ammunition, better fire control systems. The NVA would continue fighting with equipment designed for different wars against different enemies, and in the spaces between ideology and industrial capacity, men would die learning lessons that could have been taught with slide rules and penetration tables. Burke turned away from the battlefield and headed back to his tank. There was work to do. The morning after belonged to the mechanics and the dead. Burke watched as recovery teams worked to extract Private First Class Marcus Webb's body from the driver's compartment of his Patton, a task made difficult by the twisted metal where the NVA round had penetrated. The medics handled the remains with professional care, but Burke could see the strain in their faces. Webb had been 22 years old, from Pennsylvania, a competent driver who'd kept the tank moving through terrain that would have stopped lesser crews. Now he was being loaded into a body bag while the war continued around him, indifferent to individual loss. Specialist Johnson was already on a medevac helicopter bound for the field hospital at Pleiku. The broken arm would heal. The psychological impact of being inside a tank when it got penetrated, that was harder to predict. Some men came back from it ready to climb back in. Others never wanted to see a tank again. Burke had written letters home before. He'd write more today. But the words never got easier, and the explanations never felt adequate to the families who received them. The damage assessment team arrived at 0900, a lieutenant from battalion maintenance and 2 sergeants who knew M48 Pattons the way surgeons knew anatomy. They crawled over Burke's tank with measuring tools and flashlights, examining every scar and gouge the NVA shells had left behind. The lieutenant took photographs of each impact point, documenting the battle damage for after-action reports that would be filed in triplicate and studied by analysts who'd never heard a round ricochet off armor plate. "Frontal hits are superficial," the lieutenant said, running his hand over the deepest crater. "Steel's compressed but not cracked. These'll need to be ground down and welded smooth, but the structural integrity's intact. Side penetration's another story." Burke already knew that. The hole in the sponson armor was the size of a dinner plate, edges peeled back like a sardine can. The round had been a solid shot, not a shaped charge, which explained why Johnson had survived. A heat round at that angle would have turned the entire crew compartment into an oven. "Can you patch it here?" "We can weld a plate over it, get you mobile and combat ready in 48 hours. Proper repair'll have to wait until you rotate back to base." The lieutenant made notes on his clipboard. "You got lucky, Captain. 6 inches higher and that round goes through the turret ring. Different angle, and it finds the ammunition storage. Tank like this, hit where you got hit, you should be counting 3 dead instead of 1. Burke didn't feel lucky, but he understood the lieutenant's point. Armor warfare was a game of angles and penetration values, where centimeters determined whether a crew went home or went home in boxes. The M48's design had saved them. Thick frontal protection that forced enemy tanks to maneuver for flank shots, and even then, sponson armor that could sometimes stop rounds that shouldn't have been stopped. By midday, engineers had finished clearing the approaches to the camp. 2 of the destroyed PT-76s were pushed into a ravine with a bulldozer. The others were left where they'd died, hulks of Soviet steel that would rust in the jungle until they became part of the landscape. Intelligence teams had crawled through each wreck, collecting serial numbers and examining ammunition types, building a picture of NVA capabilities that would inform future engagements. Sergeant Doyle found Burke in the command tent, studying maps of the surrounding terrain. "Got the count from S2. Confirmed 8 PT-76s destroyed, 3 BTR-50s abandoned. Estimated 200 enemy KIA, mostly infantry. They're still finding bodies in the wire. What about prisoners? 5. 3 tank crew, 2 infantry. Medics are patching them up now. Doyle paused. One of the tankers is talking. Says his unit was the 203rd Armoured Regiment, based out of Dak To. They'd been training for this assault for 2 months. Soviet advisors told them the PT-76's mobility would offset any American armor advantages. Burke looked up from the map. Soviet advisors got a lot of their people killed. That's what the prisoner said. Well, not in those words. But he made it clear they weren't expecting M48s. Intelligence told them we had M41 Walker Bulldogs here, light tanks, 76mm guns, armor they could actually hurt. They thought it'd be a fair fight. The M41 Walker Bulldog was a reconnaissance tank, fast and maneuverable, but lightly armored. Against PT-76s, the engagement would have been much more even. Both tanks could penetrate each other's armor at combat ranges. Both crews would have had reason to be afraid. But Company B didn't have M41s. They had M48 Pattons, main battle tanks that outweighed the PT-76 by nearly 40 tons and carried armor thick enough to make NVA guns irrelevant. Bad intelligence gets people killed, Burke said, on both sides. The afternoon brought visitors from Pleiku. A colonel from brigade headquarters arrived with a photographer and a determination to document everything for the historical record. Burke spent an hour walking the battlefield, explaining fields of fire and engagement ranges while the photographer snapped pictures of destroyed NVA vehicles. The colonel asked the kinds of questions that revealed he'd never commanded tanks in combat. Theoretical inquiries about optimal engagement doctrine that assumed neat, predictable conditions that never existed when shells were flying. But Burke answered patiently because that was part of the job. The colonel would write a report. The report would work its way up the chain of command. Analysts at MACV headquarters would study the engagement and draw conclusions about armored warfare in Vietnam. Some of those conclusions might even be correct. And maybe, somewhere down the line, those conclusions would keep other tank crews alive. By evening, the camp had settled back into its normal rhythm of tension and boredom. Burke stood on the perimeter berm, watching the sun set behind the same mountains that had swallowed the retreating NVA forces. Somewhere out there, Lieutenant Colonel Tuan was reorganizing his surviving units, reporting losses to Hanoi, trying to explain how an assault that looked perfect on paper had disintegrated against the reality of American armor. Doyle joined him, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from one of the Special Forces troops. Think they learned their lesson? They're not stupid, Burke said. They'll adapt. Probably already are. Next time they come at us, it won't be with tanks. It'll be with RPGs and recoilless rifles, weapons that can hurt us if they get the angle right. They'll hit supply convoys instead of fortified positions. They'll mine the roads and ambush us in places where our armor advantages don't matter as much. So we won. But we didn't win? Burke considered that. We proved something they needed to learn, that they can't fight our tanks with their tanks. Not here, not with what they've got. That's worth knowing. For them and for us. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful if they weren't lighting up a battlefield. Burke thought about Webb, about Johnson, about Corporal Nguyen Than Tuan, whose journal told a story of confidence meeting reality. The M48 Patton had done its job. The crew had done their job. The technology had proven superior to the ideology that claimed technology didn't matter as much as revolutionary fervor. But wars weren't won by single engagements or superior armor plate. They were won by accumulation of victories and losses, of lessons learned and mistakes repeated, of political will and public opinion. Ben Het was one data point in a larger equation that no amount of armor thickness could solve. Burke turned away from the sunset and headed back to his tank. There was always maintenance to oversee, reports to write, preparations to make for the next engagement. Because there would be a next engagement. the NVA hadn't quit. They'd just learned to be more careful about where and how they fought American armor. And in that learning, in that adaptation, lay the kernel of something Burke was only beginning to understand, that superior technology could win battles, but couldn't always win wars, especially when the enemy was willing to absorb losses and keep fighting anyway. The M48 Patton sat in its revetment, scarred but operational, ready for whatever came next. That would have to be enough.